guys, welcome to another video. You've seen the title. I'm delighted to have my old mucker back, Mr. Tony Temple. How are you, sir?
Very well, Al. Thanks for having me on yet again. It's just like the fourth time, I think.
Fourth, something like that. But it's always a pleasure to have you on, Tony.
Likewise.
Are you all set for Christmas?
Do you know, I was just thinking today, I think so. I've kind of spread my Christmas shopping over a few weeks now. So there's a pile of boxes down there from Amazon, but I can't remember what's in them or who I've bought for. So when we're done here, I probably should open them and just make sure I've covered all the family bases, or else.
So do you have to wrap your own presents?
Probably on Boxing Day.
Do you have to wrap your own presents, or does Cheryl take care of you do?
No, I've got to do all my own. All left to me. Cool. Same with the ironing.
Really?
Oh yeah, got to do all my own ironing.
Nothing wrong with that. I actually had to teach myself to iron, but I'm getting there. Top tip, by the way, I've been. Every time I wrap presents, I always think, I wish I'd got one of these sellotape dispensers. Bought one on Amazon, £6, and it weighs about 2 kilograms, so it doesn't budge, and it absolutely takes the pain out of wrapping presents.
This is what I love about your show, Al. You get practical life tips as well as video game talks. Brilliant.
Saves you having to bite all the bits of sellotape and then stick it to the table, and before you know it, you've ran out of table and you've got it sticking everywhere else. But anyway, listen, you've seen the title. We want to talk about this bad boy. This is Tony's new book. When I say new book, this is the only book you've written, Tony, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's my first book. It actually came out about 2 months ago. And yes, it's my only book, and I think it's going to be my only book. It was quite a long, laborious process, so I don't think I want to write books for a living.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not to say it's not excellent, because it really is very good.
No, well, I've got to say, I've been reading a chapter every night, and I'm using these wonderful. I better not show them, because are they not special edition? Have you ran out of these cards?
You've just given them away. I have actually got a few left. Yes, but they're not forever.
They're wonderful, so I'm using them as a kind of bookkeeper. But I've got up to chapter 23, so I think that's the last chapter, isn't it?
It is. Yep.
It is. Fascinating book. I mean, obviously, I'll let you just kind of give a wee bit kind of background to the book. What did you actually set out to do with this, Tony? Other than chart your kind of meteoric rise to become world champion, what was the intentions of the book?
So it was twofold, really. I always felt that the development story of Missile Command is it's just super interesting, and it's a story that's never really been told properly. There is another book out there called 8-Bit Apocalypse, I think that's what it's called. 8-Bit Armageddon, 8-Bit Apocalypse. And it's a guy in the States, a guy called Alex Rubin, who wrote a book about the development of Missile Command. And his was more about what Missile Command was in the context of the Cold War of the early 80s, which we all remember being of a certain age. But I always felt it was a little bit light on detail in terms of the actual what went into writing the game. How did it come up with the idea? What iterations of the game did they go through? So the first version of Missile Command is completely different to the final game, which was released. And there's a whole story about how they delved into adding detail into the game, and then obviously play tested it, and then realized it wasn't going to work. And also the actual physical cabinet itself changed very significantly. So the initial cabinet, as you will have read in the book, had this enormous attract screen, which was supposed to provide the players with information as they played. And they put a huge amount of effort into designing and programming this screen, and all of these status lights would show on it, so that as you're playing, you can look up, look at the status lights, see where you are, and then come back to the game. And as you've just figured out, you're playing, looking at the screen, and you look up, suddenly you're not looking at the screen anymore. And it's something which didn't twig with Atari as the game was being made, and that feedback only came after they play tested that cabinet out in the field. So players were saying, well, I'm looking up at these status lights and I don't really understand them. And then by the time I'm looking back at the screen, I've lost another city. It's just crazy. It just isn't working. So in quite brutal fashion, they just cut the whole thing off and just made some subtle tweaks to the gameplay so that all of the information that this big screen would normally give you is actually presented to you on the screen. So you don't need to take your eyes off the play area, as it were. And then the book sort of goes into how they made the cabinet. There's an interview in there with the guy who designed the artwork for the arcade release of Missile Command. And then some more sort of interesting stories about what happened after it was released and some of the kits that were produced to enhance the game by a third-party company. That's another interesting story. And then it cuts back to me as a 12-year-old kid walking into a cafe in Bristol and discovering this game, Missile Command. And it then sort of charts my own journey from playing the game as a 12-year-old kid through to the old fart that I am now as the world record holder of Missile Command, and all sorts of shenanigans that have gone on in later years with regards to the world record on Missile Command. So it's sort of two parts really. One is a really sort of deep dive historical analysis of where the idea for Missile Command came from, a little bit of the context about when it was released and what was going on in the world at that time, what went into producing the game, its eventual release, and then of course my own journey with the game. So it's a two-parter. I guess what's different, I think, about my book is it isn't the usual sort of retro gaming glossy collectible book that the community is used to. So you normally throw money at a Kickstarter. You have to wait for 6 months for something to be produced. And what's produced is, a fine looking collectible book, but it's more of a sort of coffee table style where you can sort of casually go to it and flip to a page, read something and close it, look at the nice pictures, etc. This is a 77,000 word book. So at its heart, it's a book to read. But there's just under 60 color pictures in it, many of which have never been seen before, just to run alongside the dialogue and to give some context to the story as it's being told. So yeah, it's a book as opposed to a.
So what sort of prompted you to write it? I mean, other than thinking, well, there's not really been a definitive Missile Command book. Was it something you just wanted to do? Because I mean, to completely change the subject, I've always had a hankering to write a book about my childhood and growing up, because I think it would be quite interesting for people, and I really, really want to do it, and I've just been too damned lazy. Was it just I mean, obviously, I don't have anything glamorous like becoming a world champion at a video game, but was it just something you wanted to? Had it always been? I think you mentioned, was it not been like 7 years you've been thinking about it? I mean, I wasn't really aware it'd been that long, Tony.
Yeah, the idea came into my head when about 7 years ago, and I just thought I really should tell this story, and I started writing a few bits and started sort of piecing it together. But being the world's biggest, what's the word I'm looking for? Procrastinator, there you go. Being the world's biggest procrastinator, that's why it's taken 7 years. So it hasn't been sort of 7 years full-time job. It's been 7 years, when I remember, or when I can be bothered, or when I can find an hour to actually sit and start sort of typing things out. So I wouldn't say I started at the start and finished it at the finish. I just sort of thought I really should mention that somewhere and sort of write a few paragraphs, and then ultimately just sort of keyed it together into what I hope is a good sort of chronological story. But so yeah, I think aside from, I really should write a book about the game that I obviously love so much. But I think there was probably a bit of a, tick the box. I've written a book. I'm a published author. So there was just a bit of I just sort of feel like I've got a book in me, and I'm going to get it out there in print, as it were.
Yeah. So what did you get any? I mean, I know you got help from a few of your kind of friends putting it together. How did you have an idea in your head that I want to start at the very, very beginning? Obviously, you've got Dave Toyer, who, I mean, you've some of the people that you brought into the book, phenomenal. I mean, there must be a lot of research, or you've got a lot of contacts, obviously, through the fact that you're such a kind of, you're well known within the sort of the classic video games.
Yeah, well, Dave Toyer's an interesting one. So Dave Toyer was the guy who wrote Missile Command. He also was responsible for Tempest and iRobot at Atari. And I'd had some sporadic correspondence with him via email, which sort of dating back to the early 2000s, so sort of 2007, 2008. And we'd exchanged a couple of emails, but he was a man of few words and a very private guy. So trying to get anything out of him was difficult. And I really felt I wanted his input to make the book credible, really. So I wouldn't say I've been stalking him, but I've been sort of, constantly emailing him over the years, saying hello, and I'd get the odd hello back or nothing at all for 6 months. And then he sort of finally relented 3 years ago and said, listen, okay, fine, because I kept saying, any chance we could have a conversation about Missile Command? And he ended up saying, listen, anytime you're, in California, hook me up and we'll meet and we'll have a lunch and we'll talk about Missile Command. So I was like, okay, I'll give you a date. So I'm not sure how much of that he was thinking, this guy's never going to fly halfway across the world to sit down with me to talk about a 40-year-old video game. But I did. So I kind of put him on the spot, and he graciously agreed to meet with me. And he's just super helpful, incredibly nice guy. Man of few words, but, gets to the point pretty quickly. And really, from there, it was just about, well, who else was involved? Oh, there was this artist guy called Brad Chaboya. So again, just sort of hunting around, got hold of his details, managed to speak to him over the phone, had a long conversation with him. There's another guy called Mike Jang, who was one of the industrial engineers at Atari. He was incredibly helpful as well. And I had sort of long email conversations with him about what his involvement was, what was the starting point of the cabinet, and what went into building the physical aspect of Missile Command. And I was sort of struck by how involved it was, because it's very easy to just walk up to any old arcade machine and think, oh, right, it's got a screen, it's got a control panel. That's it. There's nothing more to it, and there's some pretty art on it. But the amount of thought that goes into how high should the cabinet be? Are there going to be reflections off of the screen? So if the monitor's tilted like this, are the lights in the ceiling of an arcade going to reflect back to the player's eyes so they can't see properly? Even the angle of the control panel. So should it be flat? Should it be 45 degrees? Should it be 20 degrees? All of that is sort of thought through, and they'll build a prototype and stand there and go, yeah, this kind of feels right. The trackball, where should the trackball be placed? Should it be on the left or the right? What about these fire buttons? All of this stuff, which you just totally take for granted when you walk up to an arcade machine. But yeah, that was one of the more interesting conversations I had, and I hope it comes through in the book, is the level of thought and detail that goes into the ergonomics of, does this feel right to a player? And not just adults, but also kids as well. So it's a very broad, arcades were a very broad church in the early 80s. So they had to come up with an arcade cabinet that kids could play, and teenagers and older people as well. So that whole thought process was very interesting. So he was a great guy to pin down and
Well, if you're going to get a definitive Missile Command, then you get the guy that wrote the game, don't you?
Well, yeah, exactly. And my thinking was always, if I don't get Dave Toyer to talk to me, the book's going to be a lot poorer. And I think that's right. I think as you read through it, you'll get a sense that a lot of the information that I share in the book has come straight from Dave Toyer's mouth and has just added that additional credibility. And I was quite surprised at how much I learned. So I kind of thought of myself as something of an expert on the game and what went into the game. But really talking to Dave, there was just so much more detail that, like I say, just hasn't been told before. So it was great to get that down. And I was fortunate enough that Dave agreed to write a foreword for the book as well, which again is probably a relatively small point from the outside in, but for me as the guy who wrote the book about my favorite game, to have the guy who wrote it agree to put his name to it in that way was a real treat. I was very pleased with that.
Absolutely. So it absolutely would be. So how old is Dave now then? What age was he when he first wrote it?
I think Dave Toyer must be in his early 70s, I think. And I think when he wrote Missile Command, he would have been sort of late 20s, early 30s, possibly.
One thing that I've become aware with kind of having this channel, and you contact people who were in the industry and that, and you do get some people who are just like, look, I'm really not interested in talking about it. It's something that I did 40 years ago. It was just a wee bit of my life, and I don't think people. I mean, was Dave quite aware of just the impact of what he actually had produced and how it's still got this love and there's still a massive kind of following for it?
I think he is, but I think he needed reminding. So to your point, I think up until recently, I think his default position has been, look, it was a job. Yeah, I wrote some games, but I've kind of moved on, and I was a young man back then. He still programs for commercial applications now, but he didn't really talk about his time at Atari. Very occasionally he would sort of come out of the woodwork and grant a couple of interviews. But it was gratifying talking to him, because there were certain points during the time that I spent with him where you could see his eyes really lit up and suddenly became very animated about a particular point. And you could see his sort of cogs going and going, yeah, that's right, yeah, that's exactly what we did, and he would enthuse enormously about it, which for a relatively sort of mild mannered kind of guy, which he is, and a man of few words, it was great to see. So yes, I think he understands the importance of what he did at Atari, but equally, I think I think like a lot of these guys, I think he's sort of slightly bemused that there are idiots like you and I who still revere these old arcade cabinets from the early 80s. I think there's a certain sort of puzzlement there. Well, okay, if you want to talk to me about it, fine.
Yeah. What was I going to say there? It's. What was I going to say there? I've completely broke my train of thought there. I can't actually remember. I was going to say something. I completely forgot what I was going to say there, Tony. But so as far as putting this large kind of control cabinet at the top. I was quite surprised when I heard that, because I don't think has there ever been any other arcade game that actually had like visual indicators that weren't part of the screen? What would be some of the early driving games? Did they have any things?
That's a good question. There are a few. There's Lunar Lander, but again, those lights come on just below the screen, so you're not having to, kind of look up and sort of take your eyes off the screen. Really, it's just a sort of quick glance down, a few centimeters. So no, I think, and to Dave Toyer's point about actually removing the screen, there's probably a very good reason why there aren't, because clearly it just doesn't work for a player. And I think that level of complexity probably sounded and looked great in the lab, but when you actually sit players in front of the machine and get them to play it, that's when you find out whether it really works or not. Because it might work for you because you're a techie programmer and you're trying to create this fantastic thing, and you come up with this idea and you invest in it, but that doesn't mean it's going to work out in the field. And not to mention, it housed, I think it was 28 individual incandescent light bulbs. So you can imagine these machines being left on for several days on end in an arcade. Those bulbs are going to start to blow, which means it becomes completely worthless, because if the lights aren't going to light up, it isn't going to tell you the information that Dave Toyer wanted to tell you to help you with your game. So I think that was another factor, was that they realized, well, these bulbs are going to blow. What are the chances of an arcade operator getting a screwdriver out, taking the panel off and replacing the bulbs? It's just not going to happen. So do you know what? Let's just take it out, and some of the really important information that's on that screen that we want to tell the player, let's bring it into the game. So, for example, if your viewers are familiar with Missile Command, when you get low on missiles, you hear an audible tone. It's like a beep, 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 which is telling you it's low. On the original game with the big panel, there was no audible warning. A light came on, so you had to look up to go, right, I'm low on missiles, and I'm going to do whatever I need to do to manage that. So now that they've got rid of the panel, they brought that information to the screen. So Dave Toyer added the audible warning, so you don't need to look anywhere. You just know from that sound that you're low on missiles. And also added the word "low" underneath the base actually on the screen. Yeah. So that's that solved. And there's more lights on the left-hand side of that screen which tell you where the missiles are. So there's like a light that comes on that says, right, the missiles got here.
So altitude type thing,
like an altitude thing. Now it's there, and they realise, well, yeah, it kind of looks pretty and it's a bit fancy, but I can figure that out by just looking at the bloody screen, because you can see where the missile is. So we don't need that anymore. So that's gone. So I think they realised by just sort of going through it logically, actually, this doesn't even need to be there. It's distracting players. There's nothing this panel is telling you that we can't either remove or indeed, add to the screen. And I was quite surprised at Dave's response when I said to him, well, having invested so much time and effort into it, were you not disappointed when the engineer said, right, that's it, we're just going to get rid of it? And he was like, no, I was really relieved, because it was difficult to program. It wasn't really adding anything. It really was a distraction when it was meant to be the complete opposite. So he said, I was glad to remove it. And of course, don't forget, Atari were pleased, because it was going to save them a bunch of money.
So how many of these? I think there was only a handful of these ones made, the prototypes, was it?
Yeah, so there's a bit of debate about it, but according to Dave himself, they produced 5 of these prototype cabinets, and so I'm sort of happy to accept his word for it. So there are only 5, and it's really one of the key reveals of the book. As a collector, and obviously as someone who really likes the game Missile Command, it's all I've ever seen of this cabinet is a single picture that appeared in a magazine once upon a time. Really? That was obviously taken many years ago. And one of the key reveals in the book is that I managed to find what is believed to be the only surviving prototype Missile Command anywhere. It's serial number 001. It's all original except for the PCB. So the PCB doesn't include the functionality to make the lights work. so it
that's a
uses a later series PCB, which is a bit of a shame. But apart from that, it's in almost immaculate condition. It's a stunning thing to look at. And yeah, I managed to find it, and the owner very kindly, after a huge amount of persuasion, allowed me to picture the cabinet and share the pictures in the book. So yeah, that was a probably the most satisfying piece to be able to sort of click together for the book was being able to find that cabinet and visiting the owner and them agreeing on the condition of anonymity for obvious reasons.
Okay, yeah. So you're not going to give us his name then at all? Is it somebody in America, presumably?
I couldn't possibly say. Actually, no. I can tell you, it's not in North America.
Really? Yeah.
And it's not a he.
All right, there you go.
It's a she. I'll just see if I can find a picture of it, actually. If that would.
Yeah, what you can do if you bring up the computer, Tony, and then you go to share screen, you can actually pick, and you can pop a picture up.
I wasn't going to be that technical.
No, but you can do that.
Okay. I was just going to.
You look for it, I'll just talk. One thing that when I was all right, you're just going to show it. All right, there we go.
There you go.
Wow.
So this is the big attract panel.
Beautiful.
If any of you know what a Missile Command machine looks like, it doesn't look anything like that. So it was this big attract panel that was originally on the cabinet, and these individual lights all light up to give you information of what's going on the screen.
I could just look at the book. Yeah, for myself. I like that, looking at the screen closer to see it. But one thing that, as I said, I've been reading. I read a chapter. I go to my bed and I read a chapter, and I've got a little handheld in the bed as well. And what I've been doing is, when I was reading through it and it's talking about, the audible sound when you're down to low missiles. Oh, is that right? And then I was, right, okay. And then it's amazing how I wouldn't say I'm any better at the game at all, because it's a damn hard game to play, but it's interesting hearing why things were put in for what reason. And one of the things I thought was quite interesting, I mean, well, before I move on to that, is he was going to, there was talk of instead of just having, the cities that were all going to be named. So if you had a Scottish version, you'd have Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, and Perth, or whatever, I mean. But then they chose not to do that. What was the reason? Was it just because it would be too hard to kind of change the names? You think they could have maybe had them set to dip switches and you mispicked them, whatever, eh?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of things going on. I think there was some concern from management about the actual subject matter of the game. And one of the original names they wanted to use was Armageddon, and Apocalypse was floated around as well. And they were concerned that, well, does anybody know what that word actually means? And also, doesn't it sort of make it a little bit real as opposed to a game? And we need to remind ourselves that this is a game. And I think one of the trains of thought was, if you name the cities, it kind of makes it a little bit too real, and it sort of moves beyond the game. But I think probably the main reason was they were concerned that operators wouldn't set the game up properly. So there was talk of naming the cities along the west coast of America. So you'd have Los Angeles, Montecito, San Francisco, all up the west coast. They were going to name the east coast as well. So you'd have New York, Boston, etc. And then there was talk of European names as well. So bear in mind, you would have to ship. The game could be shipped anywhere, and you're relying on an operator to set the dip switches properly because you're on the east coast as opposed to the west coast. And would that actually mean anything for someone living in Iowa in the center of America? Probably not. So it's just an additional complexity. What's the point? Let's just take it out. And I think that's the ongoing theme of the development of Missile Command is simplification. So it actually started out a pretty complicated game with the naming of the cities. The screen was originally going to be a radar screen with a sort of sweeping view and sort of bits of the game disappearing every now and then. There were going to be submarines in there. There were going to be little trucks taking missiles from the cities to the bases. There was going to be this huge attract panel with lots of lights on it. And, gradually as they played the game through and as they started developing it, they just stripped out all of this complexity. So you end up with this, clean, pure, simple gameplay on a screen in color. And it's a great example of that, I think, is starting out with a fairly complex idea and then working through those ideas, trying to implement them on screen, and then, coming to various conclusions on the way of, well, that can stay, but that can probably go, and that should go, and that should go. So it's just kind of a sort of whittling down of those ideas into a nucleus of what became Missile Command, the game.
From a graphical point of view, it's probably one of the ugliest looking games you'll ever play. Really, I know you might disagree, but I remember actually seeing that. It's funny. Are you like that as well, as you can remember where you saw certain games for the first time? I could rhyme off probably a dozen games. I remember seeing Commando and Black M6 Services. But I remember seeing the Missile Command. It was in a community centre farm, and when we got out at lunchtime from school, you either got a sausage roll and a cake, or else you could spend your 50 pence and get a sausage on a roll at this farm. And I remember going along there and queuing up, and there was this thing, and it was Missile Command, and I was kind of looking at it, and then I saw these lines coming down, and I thought, oh, an ugly looking game, and then you just go the end, and it's like, I actually it was quite a terrifying game to look at. And just, right. One of the big things that comes across in the book, Tony, I think that's been deliberate, is that you continually going on about just the real fear that you felt as a child growing up in the sort of late 70s and early 80s, and I was exactly the same. I was literally terrified of that we were going to be killed by a nuclear bomb. And so having things like that, plus you had all these infernal public information films, what to do in the event of a nuclear war. Put your granny in a bag and put her outside, and she'll be picked up in a couple of days' time. And it was just a horrific time. It really was, horrible.
Oh, yeah, without doubt. And these were some of the things which haunted Dave Toyer as well at the time, which you can read about in the book. But yeah, for sure. As kids, young kids, this stuff was terrifying. It really was. And I often wonder if that's what drew me to the game. It was almost sort of cathartic to be able to play nuclear war, if you like, with something like Missile Command. So I think that was probably part of the attraction, was the being able to sort of play around with those fears in a slightly morbid way as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
and you're right that the real iteration of that of the big explosion when it's game over, when it says the end and then sort of comes back down, that's the money shot of Missile Command, really, isn't it?
Nobody's going to win. Yeah. Do you think Missile Command, you're talking earlier on about how they were taken out, they really made it quite a minimalist game. Excuse me. Do you think that game had Atari ever thought about making that a vector game? Do you think that would have worked? I think it would have worked quite well. What do you think?
It's a good question. Yeah, for sure. I think you're right. Notwithstanding colour vector monitors weren't quite with us then. But Dave Toyer did go on to make Tempest, which of course is a classic colour vector game. But yeah, I think you're right. And you may have seen Atari recently released their game Missile Command Recharged, which is available for Android mobile. I think you can get it on the Switch and your consoles and on Steam.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of vector looking. So it's been given the, Geometry Wars treatment, where it's funky graphics and what have you, but the core of the game is still there. So that will give you a clue as to maybe what it may have looked like had it come out as a vector title. But yeah, that's a good call, actually. I think you're right. Yeah, I think it definitely could have worked.
Yeah. Interesting. If there's any clever programmers that want to maybe knock it all beat, I'm sure yourself and myself will quite happily beta test it.
Yeah.
If that's possible. Obviously, another one that the major thing about that Missile Command has, where it differs from probably every other game back then and even now, is the trackball. What persuaded Dave to go for the trackball? Because it was it wasn't. Well, I think there was an earlier game that used the trackball. I think you mentioned. I can't remember what it was.
Right. Yeah. So Dave Toy's first game before Missile Command was Atari Soccer.
Oh.
And so he programmed that. He programmed that from the ground up, and Atari Soccer does use trackballs. So I think during the development of his first game, Atari Soccer, he realized that the trackball could give a level of precision that a traditional joystick couldn't give. So if you've ever tried to play Missile Command on MAME using your cursor keys on your laptop or your PC, it just doesn't work. So what the trackball gives you is that level of precision to allow you to move your crosshair exactly where you want it to be on screen. So that's the reason for that. It's Missile Command is a game that requires precision, and I think the only thing in terms of game mechanics which could give you that level of precision is indeed a trackball. So that's the reason why, and I guess he was inspired with the fact that his first game used the very same trackball, the 4-inch Atari trackball.
Of course, there was basketball. It was one of the earliest games that I saw.
Yeah, that's right.
Atari basketball. It was just the 2 players, wasn't it?
Right. Yeah. Good call. Yeah. Exactly right.
I think that was a smaller track. That was like a pool ball size, I think. Whereas obviously the Missile Command. So, but the Missile Command one's actually made by a bowling company.
Yeah. So the trackball you find in a Missile Command cabinet is a Canadian candle pin bowling ball. So if you go to America and play a game called Candle Pin, which I believe is like 10-pin bowling with a variant on there, that's what you'll be throwing down the alley, a Missile Command trackball. So yeah, Atari simply found a manufacturer who made bowling balls and placed an order for 14,000 of the things to stick in their trackballs.
So was that how many Missile Command machines were sold then? 14,000.
Yeah, just over 14,000 in total.
Now, one thing I think you mentioned, what would Atari's profit on a machine be if they sold one?
Yeah, so Missile Command was sold for about $2,000, and it cost them $850 in parts to build it. So obviously not including transportation and labor costs, etc. So, £1,000 a cabinet in terms of sort of, gross profit before those additional costs. So 14,000 times $1,000. It's a multi-million-dollar selling game back in 1980. Remember, this is not now. So the margins were very healthy, and I think the one thing you discover when you dig into the Atari archives and you start looking at some of the documentation, you realize that one of the targets they set themselves in the coin-operated division was to have that sort of 50% gross margin at least. So to build a cabinet, they want to be able to build it for half the cost that they would eventually sell it for. So yeah, big bucks. big money, and you know, whilst it was a good selling game, it certainly wasn't their best selling game. That accolade goes to Asteroids, where I think they sold around 75,000 units. But yeah, very healthy numbers for sure.
Mm-hmm. Did Atari, when they obviously did they sell the machines to arcade owners, and did they get any of the revenue that it generated, or was that all to
No,
basically?
Yeah, so that's how the Atari's business model was selling hardware. So they would sell a missile command cabinet to an operator or a distributor who would distribute the games, and they were already working on their next arcade game. So what they wanted the operator to do was to buy the latest release, let's say Missile Command, put it on their arcade floor for 6 months, comfortably get their money back in a matter of weeks, and then make a profit for the remaining time it was popular on the arcade floor. And then when people stopped playing it, or when people got too good at it and stayed on the machine all day, which meant no one else was putting any money in, one of those two things would have happened, or indeed a combination of the two. They then wanted the arcade operator to come back to them to buy the next game, which might have been, I don't know, Tempest or Battlezone or something like that. So it was all about rotating, you know, selling the new. It's kind of like Apple, you know. Apple are producing iPhones every single year because they want us all to bloody upgrade, and the arcade manufacturing business model was very similar. So Atari weren't so concerned about how well a machine did on the arcade floor because it didn't affect their bottom line. Although obviously, if a machine wasn't popular, it wasn't going to sell. But they weren't so interested in what was known as the coin drop. So how much money was being put into an arcade machine, because they never saw any of it.
Yeah,
they'd been paid for the hardware. Done. Thank you very much. It's now over to you to make a profit with that machine.
What was the kind? I don't know if that's something you can answer, Tony. What would have been like that expected life expectancy?
Very short, I think. I mean, at a guess, I would say between 6 and 9 months. One of the chapters in the book talks about a kit that was produced for Missile Command after it was released called Super Missile Attack, and the guys there, the reason they developed this kit was that they were running 3 Missile Command cabinets as sort of part of their inventory, and they discovered after 6 months that the income going into the machine just fell off a cliff after 6 months. So that was their life expectancy of Missile Command, and so it then created something of a problem. And I talk about this quite a lot on my blog. So what do? You're an arcade owner. You've paid $2,000 for a Missile Command machine, and 6 months later, nobody's playing it anymore because they've all moved on to something else, Robotron, whatever the next hot new game might be. Or you've got an arcade full of kids who are bloody fantastic at Missile Command and can't stop playing it, which means no one else can put any money in, which means you're not making any money. So what the hell do you do? You've got this huge lump of wood. You can't send it back to Atari because you bought and paid for it. So what are you going to do? So, I mean, there's a handful of options. You either smash it up and throw it, or you put it in a warehouse or a dusty old barn to be discovered 40 years later by collectors or whatever. Or you buy something called a conversion kit, which would have been a nifty bit of electronics that you would plug into the existing PCB, printed circuit board, of something like Missile Command, which would turn it into a different game, or it might speed the game up. Funnily enough, you can come across quite a few Asteroids machines which play faster than the original game. And that's because there was a speed up kit produced, and it's just a very simple hack to the original PCB, which meant everything was a little bit quicker, which made it more difficult, which was a new challenge. So people start coming back to it again and putting quarters in. So that was the whole thing related to the life shelf of.
And these conversion kits, it was basically as a group of students, wasn't it? Hackers. Did they start to write that for their own kind of pleasure, and then they realised they could sell them for like 150 quid or something, then it became a bit of a business, didn't it?
Yeah, so it was a group of students, and they were operating their own arcade machines in the dormitories at the university they were at. And so it was like a very successful enterprise on the side alongside their studies. And they had this problem with Missile Command, like it wasn't taking money anymore. And they, sort of searched around for some sort of kit to buy, and they realised no one had produced one. And so they had a spark of an idea of, well, we're all fairly clever and computer literate. Why don't we write our own kit and sell it? Because clearly there's 14,000 of these things out there. There must be a market for it. Let's just go ahead and do it. And so that's exactly what they did. And it eventually became General Computer Corp. General Computer Corp. Yeah, General Computer Corp.
Well, that was the company. Yeah, we'll not give any spoilers to what happens in the end of them, but I mean, how would that have stood? Well, I'm trying to think here. I suppose at the end of the day, they weren't. They weren't selling, say, like Missile Command. They weren't selling this game, Missile Command, or they weren't selling Super Missile Command. They were effectively they were selling an add-on which you could then buy and plug into your existing Missile Command. So they weren't really breaching any copyright, really, were they? Because they were just selling. They were selling something which you could use in addition.
Yeah.
So it worked.
Yeah, and this it all ends in court, which I won't go into. But at the time, it was uncharted territory. So don't forget, copyright law up to that point was probably mainly related to things like books and magazines and maybe the movies. These newfangled video games, which were 5 minutes old, when that particular case went to court, there was a lot of debate about, well, does the judge even know what an arcade game is? Let alone the ramifications of what these guys have done. Which in the end, as you rightly say, they did nothing to the original code. They just wrote some additional code that you plugged in. But yeah, it's just a great story, a really interesting footnote to.
I mean, I wasn't even aware of these things existing. In fact, just before I actually read your book, there was quite an interesting series. Is it called High Score on Netflix? And they talk to these guys actually.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll need to actually finish watching it. But I wasn't aware of that. And apparently, Miss Pac-Man was basically their love child version of Pac-Man, and then Atari or Namco bought it, I think, was it?
Yeah, so that came after Super Missile Attack. They wrote this add-on board for Pac-Man, and it was originally called Crazy Otto. And they took it to Midway with the wind in their sails, having just gone through this court case with Atari, and approached Namco, the guys who released Pac-Man, and said, well, we've come up with this add-on kit for Pac-Man. What do you think? And the original intention was to sell it as an add-on to Pac-Man. But Midway said, well, why don't we just release it as a whole new game? And so Miss Pac-Man was eventually born and went on to be, by some margin, the most successful coin-operated game ever built. 115,000 units of Miss Pac-Man. Astonishing.
I was quite surprised to hear that. I always thought that Pac-Man would have outsold it, but yeah, there you go. Incredible.
Yeah.
Because we're kind of moving on a wee bit, Tony.
Yeah.
We can't, you've already kind of touched on it, Rita's Cafe. That was a cafe, presumably did you pass that when you were going to school?
Exactly that. Oh, how did you know that?
Really? Aye.
Yeah, it's Rita's Cafe, sort of classic 80s greasy spoon cafe, and it was on my route to school. And walking home one day, I sort of stuck my head through the window and sort of saw these neon lights inside, and was just drawn to walk in. Opened the door, and there was Missile Command. That's how I came across it.
Was that the first time you ever saw the game? Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was probably my first conscious interaction with video games. I'd come across video games when I was about 7 or 8 with my parents, but that was really only in passing. We just happened to be at a seaside resort and happened to walk past an arcade, and Dad let me have a go on this one game. But I think in terms of my own sort of consciousness being drawn to video games, it was probably at that moment. I was 12, and it would have been, I don't know, early 1981. And
obviously kind of latched onto the kind of the fear that you had of getting blown up by a nuclear bomb. At what point did you actually realise that it was kind of had a nuclear kind of theme to it?
The beauty of most of Atari's early arcade games is they're simple to learn, difficult to master. Yeah. So, clearly to encourage someone to put a coin in, you have to look at it for 30 seconds and go, yeah, I think I get that. I can see what's going on. And I could see these things coming down the screen, and those must be cities, and there's these and they're intercepting these missiles, and there's a mushroom-like explosion when these things blow up. So I think pretty instantly I got a grip for what the subject matter was. And of course it was called Missile Commander. So it just sort of putting those pieces together, even as a 12-year-old kid, I think I had a fair idea of what the objective of the game was. I was absolutely shit, of course, on my first few goes, but like all these games, give them a few plays and you quickly figure out your own technique and what you need to do. And then of course you're hooked because you've got to get a higher score. You want to see what comes next.
One of the interesting things is you talk about a lot about the characters that go into the cafe and how your relationship kind of built with them. You were this sort of precocious brat that went into this thing and handed all these people's asses or handed their arse on a plate playing Missile Command. And there's a particularly brilliant bit where you talk about you and the guy with the dreadlocks, and was it somebody else? You jumped in a car and went. Where did you go again? You went. Was it some seaside?
Western Supermare.
How far was
that? From Bristol, it was probably a 40-minute drive. It was probably about.
It wasn't too bad.
20, 30 miles. It wasn't too far. But
did Mum and Dad know you were going with these strangers, or did they?
Well, this is I was just going to say. I mean, I spent most of the summer holiday of 1981 in Rita's Cafe, socializing with men of my age now. And I sit and look at I've got a 13-year-old son. You'd be bloody mortified. Well, hang on a second, where have you been all day? Oh, I've been sitting in this cafe talking to 50-year-old blokes. What? You've been doing what? You'd just be mortified. It was just a completely different time. And my mum knew where I was. Just didn't necessarily know what I was doing, but she knew I was at the cafe playing video games, and there would be adults there. And it was fine. It wasn't a problem. And it was fine. I mean, it really was. There were never any, dodgy moments. There was never any issue there. But yeah, it's a great demonstration of just how different things were when we were kids. It's just amazing.
Bliss. Well, it was the innocence as well. You didn't think anything of it. And again,
exactly.
You've got a fantastic photo that you said you found on the internet with the actual Missile Command. You can just through the curtain.
Yeah, someone said to me, "You must have photoshopped that because it's almost the it's when I came across the picture, it really inspired me to get on with the book. So I was in a bit of a lull, and I couldn't really see where the book was going, and I wasn't even sure if it should be a book. I wasn't even sure I had enough content in my head for it to be the right length for a book. And I came across this picture of that cafe at that exact time. And not only is it a picture of the cafe, but leaning out of the door is the owner of the cafe, who I write about in the book. And in the left-hand window, you can see the Missile Command machine. And it was just like, wow. I mean, if ever there was a sign that the universe was telling me, you need to finish this book, and here's the perfect picture that you should include in it, that was it. Yeah, I was so pleased to have come across that picture. And the guy, Mark Bemberneck is his name. He's just an amateur photographer guy from Bristol who happened to take a picture of that cafe in whenever it was, 1981 or so. And yeah, it was just great. I was so pleased I A, got hold of him, and B, he allowed me to use that picture. Yeah,
that's the thing nowadays. I mean, with smartphones, my daughter probably takes half a dozen photos every day of herself usually. But rewind back to the early 80s. I was trying to explain to Eva that back then you had a camera and you had to go and buy a film. I said I would maybe get, if I was lucky, you would get like 2 spools a year, and yet you had to save them till your holidays. There was no such thing as selfies, so you had like 24, or if you're really lucky, 36 photos that you could take in a whole year. So you wouldn't have dreamt of taking a picture of a dreary cafe. Obviously, this Mark must have been a bit of a kind of trying to get kind of arty shots.
Right.
And so the chances of that, somebody actually taking that picture, was pretty phenomenal.
Absolutely.
What? So when you went to Western Supermare, you touch on you were showboating a wee bit for a big crowd of people. That must have been quite a thrill. I mean, what age would you have been when you were playing Missile Command at that point?
I think I probably played over like a 2-year period. So from the age of sort of 12, 13 to, I don't know, 14, 15 or so. So yeah, you're right. It was all about bragging rights in the arcade. It was A, how high is my score? B, who's watching? C, shall I just walk away from this game now because I've smashed it? And often I would just get to a certain point, or maybe roll it back to 0 and then just walk away from the game and let someone else take over. That was like the ultimate pose for a 13-year-old kid, I guess. Yeah, so, it was an interesting dynamic in the arcades. There was a sort of pecking order. There was the guy who was great at every single game. There were the one-trick ponies, which I guess I was, and it was really all about Missile Command for me, and I dabble in a few other things, but Missile Command was really the only game I was any good at, and that's still the case. And then there were the sort of casual people who you wouldn't see in there regularly, but they would just turn up and sort of throw money in. And I guess that's where the profit margin was for the arcade, because they never made any money out of me, because I put a coin in, I'd be sat there for 3 hours and no one else could get a look in, and therefore the arcade wasn't earning any money.
Did you ever become conscious of like sitting there in the stool? I mean, was Rita's Cafe, was it just the regulars, or did you get a lot of passing traffic, and would people come in and maybe you could consciously feel that they're wanting a shot, but they'd probably look at your score and think this guy's going to be on all day?
Not so much in the cafe. In the cafe, it was just the regulars. There was like it was like a sitcom. There were like, I don't know, 8 of us who were the sort of hardcore group of people who always were there. There's a couple of builder guys who were always there, who lived above the cafe, and they just lived in the cafe basically. There was another guy who lived above the cafe, and there was I don't know, 3 or 4 people who, like me, who would just, the cafe was the place to go. So there was just this sort of group of us who played the Missile Command machine, the Gorgar pinball, and they had a Frogger cocktail table and a
cafe. I suppose that would make sense.
Yeah. And they had a Mooncrester upright. Great game.
So how long did you actually play Missile Command and Rita's Cafe for? How many years was that before
I'm trying to remember, but I think it probably no more than 18 months or 2 years before the owner of the cafe took the decision it's time to get rid of this and put something else in.
I was going to say, yeah.
So it was probably I want to say a 2-year window, and then there was probably another year where I could find another Missile Command locally, but I think by 83 it was long gone. And
what did they replace it with?
He replaced it with it was a converted Defender, and it had track and field in it. It was horrible. It was just the ugliest thing you've ever seen. And it also had a Buck Rogers, which looking back was a very unusual cabinet. I think it's quite rare now. It was the sit-down version of Buck Rogers, so it was kind of like a cockpit but without a roof, and you sat down in a seat and you played it. I've got memories of that. And then the place burnt down. It's a chip pan caught fire and the whole. Yeah, it burnt down and had to close. So
it would have been a better ending. It would have been a better ending if the Missile Command machine had gone on fire and burnt the place down. Oh, you've gone again, Tony. Oh, you cut out there. I don't know if you caught that last bit I said there. It would have been the perfect ending would have been if the Missile Command machine had gone on fire and burned the whole place down. That would have been a fitting end. So Rita's Cafe eventually burned down, and that was the end of it.
You're right.
Ah, blimey.
Yeah, when I say burned down, it didn't. But there was a serious fire. I mean, it didn't burn down, but there was a serious fire. And I think Peter, the owner, of the cafe had a bit of health and safety issues, i.e., he didn't have any fire extinguishers. And I think looking at the damage to the place, there was going to be. I think there's going to be some serious coin to fix it. Thank you very much.
Hello, Cheryl.
Mrs. Temple, you kindly bought me a nice glass of wine.
Oh, lovely. What was going to say? So that was kind of 1983, I reckon it was, Tony, a minute. So what happened after that? Did you kind of lose interest in video games, or then did you forget about Missile Command after that for a bit? Or?
Yeah, so I never saw a Missile Command machine again for 20, 25 years. Obviously, we kept going with video games. I had a Mega Drive and a 3DO and all that kind of stuff. So that would have been through my sort of late teens onwards. And then in my mid 30s, I discovered eBay. I kind of people are buying and selling video games. I remember these machines. I used to play them when I was a kid, and that's how I got into this stupid hobby again. And got hold of a Missile Command machine. Started playing. Realised I still had the chops. Did a bit of research and thought, I reckon I could go for the world record.
So when did you buy? I mean, one of the things I thought I loved about your book is you happened to mention Archer McLean, and you don't even begin to talk about Archer McLean, who he is. You just happen to mention that this is a guy he had a large collection of video games, and then now you don't mention any more about him. So when did you buy that cab off him?
It would have been 2004. So I had a Defender cabinet that needed a new monitor, and someone said, "You need to talk to this guy, Archer McLean." I had no idea who he was or his history or anything. Rang him up. I need to buy a monitor, and I understand you can help me. And he said, "Yeah, come on round." So I went to his house. He said, "There's the monitor," and I was like, "Wow, you've got quite a collection here." And we got talking about his collection and this old game Missile Command that I used to be pretty good at. And he said, "Come with me," and took me down to his basement. And there it was. There was an Irish Missile Command built by Atari Ireland, and I just had to have it. So a deal was struck. He restored me,
So he offered to restore it for you then, yeah?
Yeah, to this day.
Wow. Do you still keep in touch with him at all?
Do you know, I haven't. I think I exchanged an email with him a couple of years ago. I think we sort of wished each other a Merry Christmas or something. But no, I don't know what he's doing. I don't think he's into the arcade hobby anymore. But quite what he's doing now, I don't know.
So obviously you got your Missile Command in 2004. MAME was a thing. I mean, MAME kind of came out in '97. Were you aware of MAME at that point, and did you ever play Missile Command and think, bloody hell, here it is on my PC?
Yeah, I did, but it just wasn't the same. It was just horrible. And I guess that's one of the things about Missile Command is if you were a fan of the game, it does make you a bit of a purist. So whilst you can play an acceptable game of Galaxian with a keyboard, you can't play an acceptable game of Missile Command without a trackball and 3 fire buttons. So no, I didn't try and push it, as it were. I was just like, yeah, nice memories, but this isn't something I want to play.
So fast forward to 2004, you got the Missile Command. So how often were you playing it?
Pretty regularly. I established that there was a world record that I thought I could beat, and so in order to get that, I was probably playing 2 or 3 games every night, which was sort of practice up to a point. And I thought, well, I better start recording this, because if I beat the world record and I haven't recorded it, that's not going to be good. So the idea was you needed to set up a camera, film the screen of you playing, and then send it into Twin Galaxies, who were based in America, in order for them to verify your score. So after a while, you set the camera up, play a game, die, rewind the tape, start the camera again, start a new game, etc., etc. And that's probably 2 or 3 months of intensive playing like that until March 2006, when I beat the world record. And here we are, Al.
And of course,
some 16 years later.
What's that?
Some 16 years later, here we are.
Yeah, and then obviously, without any spoilers, I mean, you got to know about obviously Twin Galaxies, and you went across, and I mean, it was a brilliant story when you're talking about you and Paul Drury were across there. You were somewhat bemused at just the sort of the adulation in which you were kind of held, because you'd gone across there and basically beaten the Americans at their own game.
Yeah, it was a bit of a learning process, really, about how to conduct yourself, because I don't think either of us quite grasped what a big deal it was to them that someone from the UK has got one of our world records. But everybody was nice to a fault. Just sort of walking into that environment was a little bit strange. And this is just after they'd filmed The King of Kong. So the arcade scene over there was on a bit of a high. I think they thought. Yeah. I think they probably thought more of themselves than maybe they should have done, because these guys had made a documentary about that whole scene, and we sort of landed in the middle of it. Fascinating times. It was quite interesting.
I remember you told me a while back that there was kind of talk of a possible Missile Command film. Is that ever come to anything? Do you think it'll ever? I mean, there's definitely a story to be told, obviously with a certain character who we've not even touched on yet. But
you're talking about as a documentary, yeah.
I mean, the King of Missile Command, whatever you want to call it.
The King of Missile Command. Yeah, I suppose there's Christ, I've managed to write half a book about it. I guess there's some kind of documentary in there somewhere if someone really wanted to do it. But I think it probably would have been more interesting 10 years ago than now. So I'm certainly not playing Missile Command at the level I was, and have got no huge motivation to do so. The other character, a certain Mr. Awesome, I don't know what he's doing these days, and and whether he even plays anymore. I certainly don't think he owns a cabinet. And there's the whole him thing as well, which is, does anybody actually want to, would I want to get involved if I got a phone call tomorrow and said, hey, we're going to do King of Kong Part 2 about Miss Soccer Man, and we'd like you to be a part of it. I don't know that I would want to do, and actually I don't know that I would anyway, just as a fairly modest British bloke. I'm not entirely sure I want to open up my life to a documentary series, and I think it needs to be mainstream, and I think what the King of Kong managed with some of the characters, and I think
the rivalry wasn't very good and bad, eh? Yeah.
And key to all of that was Billy Mitchell, and I think he played a brilliant part. And I think it's a fine line between documentary about a 40 turn into this really interesting mainstream, thing that people got a kick out of. I'm not sure there's enough in the story to be the next king.
Oh, you're kind of breaking up quite badly again, Tony. It's annoying.
Does that come through?
Mate? Yeah, the last 30 seconds was all kind of, but a bit, I can't remember the name of that. Norman Collier, yep.
Oh.
But no, I mean, it's obviously. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, basically what I'm saying is I'm not sure there's enough in the Miss Soccer Man story to make, King of Kong 2, because I think the King of Kong had that sweet spot of mainstream with a larger than life character, Billy Mitchell, and there was an interesting yin and yang, and there was back and forth going on. There isn't so much of that with Miss Soccer Man. I don't think.
I know. I mean, Roy Schilt, Mr. Awesome. I mean, he was quite a scary looking guy. I mean, to be fair to him, what a physique he had on him back in the day.
Yeah.
He was in Playboy and everything. I mean, you actually feel quite sorry for the guy, because he was obviously just craving respect and acknowledgement of what he'd achieved. I mean, to be fair to the guy, I mean, he managed to get onto the Howard Stern show, so he must have been doing something right. Although I think I have watched that video and they kind of make a fool of him, I think, which I'm not overly comfortable with, and I'm sure you'd be the same. Actually, quite a kind of sad individual, I think.
Yeah, I always found Mr. Awesome something of a sort of dichotomy. I think half of him was, had quite a wicked sense of humor, and he was actually quite witty and funny on occasion. But then there's another side to him which just comes out with where he obsessively chases, respect and fame, if you can even call it that, and celebrity. And yet I think the ironic thing is, had he played it right, I think he could have been another Billy Mitchell. So he had this, Mr. Awesome persona. People are drawn to him. There's kind of something about the guy who stirs the shit that's quite appealing. He's the he's the Jimmy White. He's the action packed guy with no off switch. He never censors himself. He says what he means. And from the outside in, there's a certain fascination with him as a character and the things he's done. His appearance on the Howard Stern show, the bodybuilding he did as a young man and then revisited in his 60s. I don't know if you ever come across that video. Whoa, it's quite something.
Is that really?
Yeah. Search for Mr. Awesome Bodybuilder on YouTube. Don't say I didn't. But don't say I'd never warned you. I
have been warned. Yeah.
So I don't know. He I look back on it all as with a certain affection. I think there's something quite endearing about Roy. I think he played a sort of plucky guy who felt that the world shit on him, and I'm not the true world record holder. He is, and dip switch settings and all that kind of stuff.
I mean, I think he was quite. He sent you an email. And he was quite kind of gracious in defeat, although he was still kind of making excuses. But then the whole it then started to get sour because he was basically saying that you had is it the dip switch 14? I think it is.
Dip switch 4.
Dip switch 4, which to people that haven't read the book, basically that changes how sensitive. Is it how sensitive?
Right.
Or the speed of the cursor or the crosshair?
It's the sensitivity of the trackball. So how far do you have to roll it to cover a certain distance? And there's 2 settings, and one requires more effort to move from point A to B than the other setting.
But it's more accurate because it's like a mouse. If you have it going too quick,
exactly. Yes, exactly.
The one that moves less takes longer to master, so it's technically more difficult.
Well, yeah, there's I don't think there's an easier and a hard. They're just different. So whilst having a more sensitive trackball that requires less effort to get from point A to point B, you've got to master the accuracy. So think about the mouse on your PC. Mm-hmm. If you set it so it's like super quick, so if you move the mouse a centimeter, but the cursor on your screen moves right across the screen.
Yeah.
Well, that's not great because you can't bloody control it. It's like, well, I'm trying to click the thing in the middle and I can't because it's just too sensitive. Mm-hmm. Same principle applies. So there's 2 settings, and the rules are you can play on whichever one you want. And I play with that setting in the off position, and Roy played with the setting on the on position.
Allegedly.
Well, yes. The other thing is who knows what setting he played it on, because nobody cared back in the day, and now suddenly it's an issue. And so, his argument is, well, you should have played on the same setting as me, then therefore your record doesn't count. Well, that's not what the rule book says, old son. And don't moan at me. I'm just a guy who plays the game. You need to moan at those guys, And that went on for, 10 years.
I mean, the funny thing is, here's a guy from... So where is it you come from, Tony? Where is it you hail from?
I'm from Bristol originally.
Bristol. Here's a sort of a 13-year-old from Bristol. Well, you were a bit older when you got the world record. You broke the world record having learned the game at Rita's Cafe, and then you go across to America and this shitstorm unleashes itself. You're like, what the hell have I got myself into?
Oh yeah,
guy that's stalking you. And were you ever quite concerned that he was going to turn up and kill you?
No, not really. I think a few people have sort of joked about that. Paul used to say, Paul used to crack jokes about, Mr. Wilson might turn up and take you out or whatever. But no, Roy's harmless enough. He's just a bit of a pest, I guess. But no, I never feared for my life. But I think the most surprising thing is just how serious these guys were taking all this. Not only the guys who were like, wow, you're the Missile Command guy. It's like, I'm just a bloke who happens to, I just play a video. Yeah, okay, fine, I'm the Missile Command guy. And then there's Roy, who's like, this is his life. It's like, I remember Paul questioning him once, and I remember him saying, well, come on, Roy, surely you've got, more important things like family and, there's a life outside of Missile Command, right? And it's like, no, there isn't. This is it. This is what this is the thing that makes me important. And, I'm going to fight to get my world record back, or, come hell or high. And this was his thing. His thing was being the Missile Command world champion. So I guess when I, stumbled into the scene and beat his score.
It ruined his life.
I ruined Roy Schultz. I guess, yeah. Now, you put it like that. I guess in a way, I guess I kind of did. But hey, it made for an interesting story, so I guess it's not all bad.
It does. You take Roy. I mean, to take nothing away from what you achieved, Tony. I mean, if you take Roy Schultz out of the story, it does certainly make it an interesting story because,
yeah, without doubt, yeah.
Don't talk about the Crystal Castle's high score or whatever it is. I mean, you got Donkey Kong, you got Missile Command with Roy Schultz, and Mr.
Yes. And funnily enough, he did email me last week, and Roy Schultz emailed me last week.
Wow!
This is the first time in 3 years I've heard anything from him. Yeah, I won't go into it, but it's the usual stuff.
Does it mention your book by any chance?
No, it doesn't. No, don't know if he's seen it or if he hasn't. Don't really care. But yes, it's the usual stuff. He's copied me into an email to the head of Guinness World Records, and he's still going on. He's still going on about the Missile Command World Record, and it's just like, dude, God's sake, move on.
It's just as well he's not Scottish, because I'll tell you, he ain't used to being to failure when you're Scottish. I mean, he would never ever get over it, but dearie me. But one thing, I mean, it's an interesting, as you say, it's a book of two halves. You've got the whole, you go into, real detail. You've got all the guys from back in the day about the Missile Command, and then the second part is how Missile Command, became a big part of your life, and how thing would be Roy Schultz. But what I really enjoyed was when you had your. I'm not going to have any spoilers, but when you got your world score, high score record, Robert. How do you spell Robert Murchak? The Murchak. He kind of broke down each level by level and how you scored in each level, which is interesting. So, whilst it is a coffee table book, it's for the anal Missile Command fan. They'll love it because it really does goes into mega detail. Even what was interesting when Dave Toyer was talking about like the smart missile, it is a little bastard because I mean it'll avoid getting hit, and you've got to kind of almost like predict. What is the technique to killing that? Have you got to do it just before it? Have you got to do it bang on? Or?
Oh my God! Smart missiles. It for me, it's feel, which saying it's like a sort of sixth sense. I think ultimately with the smart bomb, because it's so intelligent, you've got no idea really how it's going to react unless you've played multiple games, and then you just get a sixth sense for, well, if I shoot right there, it's gonna nail it, But in theory, yes, you've got to hit it. Just your missile needs to start exploding just before the smart bomb hits that point, because then it's not got time to go, whoa, put the brakes on and go around. As the explosion grows, it kind of takes it out. But I think it'd be a very hard thing to teach anybody. You've just got to play the game and get a feel for how the smart bombs react, because there is a very rudimentary element of artificial intelligence programmed within the smart bomb.
So does that see the second you send a missile towards it? Does that go, hang on a second, I need to move, or is it when it actually explodes? It will backtrack.
Yeah, it's when it senses an explosion. So, we're getting really nerdy now, Al, but so that this is your smart bomb. It's got like a sort of scanner, and it's scanning like that. And as soon as it scans an explosion of any sort within this sort of scan area,
that radius,
that's when it will start either stopping, or going round, or It's
anytime I play it, I can only ever really take it out using the centre. Because it goes quite. Is it 30% quicker or something? Is it? Or?
I think it's about 50% quicker. Yeah, than the other two bases. But yes, you're right. That's a great tip, which I've not given. which is you want to take out smart bombs with the center base because they're a lot easier to shoot now.
It's a lot quicker. So anyway, so obviously we don't want to give any spoilers, but it's a fascinating book, Tony. I've really enjoyed reading it. Like I said, I think if anybody's got a passing interest in the golden age of video games, they'll absolutely love it, because there's some fantastic stories in there. The fact that you've got Dave Toyer and all the guys from Atari, even stuff about, I never really realised that a lot of the Atari machines were made in Ireland of all places. It just seemed quite a bizarre kind of place to make Atari games.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's a really important point. It's not a book just about Missile Command. So it's not just a huge nerdy read about one video game. It talks about the industry as a whole. It talks about the development process, which I'm sure you could apply to many other video games. Atari Ireland, and then throughout it, I think, is a human story. So it's a great read, I think, for anybody interested in video game history. It isn't just about Missile Command.
Yeah, just wish you'd put this video out a couple of weeks before, and it would be a perfect stocking filler.
Well, it's not too late, Al. You never know. Well, anybody can get their order in. Just go to my site, arcadeblogger.com.
I'll put the link down below. Do you personally send the books out, Tony, or is it done for a company? Or
yeah, I'm doing them here.
So you can do anyone that wants you to deface the book. They're welcome.
I'm very happy to put objectionable messages in any of the books. Yes, for sure. Funnily enough, I don't think you see those boxes over there. You see that? Over there in the corner.
Oh yeah.
So that's full of copies waiting to go to the States. So waiting to go. I've got about 15 here down by my side, ready to go to the UK. So if anybody wants a copy, I'll gladly send you one.
Like I said, we'll put the link to where you can pick these up. We'll also put the link to Tony's Arcade Blogger, superb site. I hope everyone's enjoyed watching the video, and it just remains for me to say, Tony, thanks again, buddy. I'll no doubt get you back on after the new year, mate. It's always a pleasure.
Sounds good. Thanks, Al. Thanks for having me on.
Cheers. Take care, Tony. See you, buddy.